Picture the scene. March 23rd, 2011. A private room on the 6th floor of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. Outside the door, the world prepares to mourn one of the last true legends it will ever produce. Inside, gathered around the bed, are 4 people who never made the front pages the way their mother did. 4 people who grew up in the eye of the most extraordinary human storm Hollywood ever generated, and survived it. 4 people who said goodbye quietly, privately, without cameras, without fanfare. Their mother once said, in a moment of rare honesty, "I've been through it all, baby. I'm Mother Courage." She was talking about herself. But the children were the ones who had to live inside the storm. How does a woman married 8 times to 7 different men, a woman condemned by the Vatican, chased by paparazzi across 3 continents, consumed by grief and addiction and reinvention, how does that woman raise 4 children who, by every measurable standard, turned out whole? In the next 40 minutes, you will discover why Christopher Wilding secretly eloped with the granddaughter of the richest man in the world on Sunset Strip, and what happened to her afterward. You will learn what Elizabeth Taylor said when she first saw a baby in a German orphanage who could not walk without surgery, and the words she used to explain why she wanted her more because she was ill. And you will learn what Michael Wilding Jr. said publicly on the day his mother died. A sentence so precisely worded that it has never been properly examined by anyone who covered her life. What you are about to hear is not a story about Elizabeth Taylor's marriages. It is a story about what it costs to be loved by someone the whole world also loves. The central fact of this story is a small object, an Oscar statuette, not the second one, the celebrated one for Virginia Woolf. The first one, from the film Elizabeth Taylor herself despised. After her death, only 1 child asked to keep it. That detail is where this story ends. We begin at the beginning. Before you can understand the children, you must understand what the children were born into. Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor entered the world on the 27th of February, 1932, in a house called Heathwood, on Wildwood Road, in the Hampstead Garden suburb of northwest London. Her father, Francis Len Taylor, was an American art dealer whose Bond Street gallery attracted the most socially prominent names in London. Her mother, Sarah Southern, had once been a stage actress with ambitions that the theatre never quite satisfied. When Elizabeth was 7 years old, the family fled England ahead of the German bombing campaign and settled in Beverly Hills, where Sarah's ambitions found a new outlet, not in her own career, but in her daughter's face. Elizabeth was not given a childhood, she was given a contract. By the age of 10, she was under studio agreement at MGM, trained to perform on demand, and dressed and photographed as a product. By the age of 12, she was already famous. She later said that her childhood ended the moment she became a star, that MGM took control of everything, from the shape of her eyebrows to the straightness of her teeth, transforming her into what director George Stevens once called the girl on the candy box cover. There is a scene from the film that made her a star, National Velvet, released at Christmas in 1944, where 12-year-old Elizabeth sits astride a horse on the set and falls. She tumbles, hits the ground, and the director rushes over, calling for a halt to filming. Elizabeth looks up and says, "I'm fine. Smashing. I ought to know to have kept my heels down." She was 12 years old and had broken her back. The fracture went undetected for years. She continued riding. That sentence, "I'm fine, smashing," contains the seed of everything that would later go wrong and right inside her children's lives. A mother who pushed through pain. A mother who never learned to stop. A mother who was 18 years old when she had her first child and who, by the account of every biographer who knew her story, had never been allowed to be a child herself. Michael Howard Wilding Jr. was born on the 6th of January, 1953, in Santa Monica, California. His father was Michael Wilding, a gentle British actor, 20 years older than Elizabeth, a man she chose, she said, for his calm, for his quiet, for the security of friendship after the controlled chaos of MGM. The marriage was already struggling by the time Christopher Edward Wilding arrived on the 27th of February, 1955, the same date as his mother's birthday. Elizabeth was 23 years old. She had 2 sons under 3. She had a husband whose career was being propped up by studio deals she negotiated on his behalf, and she had, by every account, an army of nannies who did the actual raising while she continued filming. She was not yet 23. She was already someone else's creation. And now she had 2 small boys in the rooms beyond the noise. The marriage to Michael Wilding ended on the 26th of January, 1957. The announcement of separation had come 6 months earlier, on the 18th of July, 1956, while Elizabeth was on location in Marfa, Texas, filming Giant alongside Rock Hudson and James Dean. Wilding, alone in Beverly Hills, had allegedly entertained 2 women in their home. A gossip magazine called Confidential published the story. The damage was done quietly, in the way most real damage is done, not in public, but in the private rooms where trust goes to die. Within months of the separation, Elizabeth had found Mike Todd. Mike Todd was not like any man she had previously known. He was 50 years old, loud, brash, self-invented, and had built a theatrical empire from nothing. He had produced 16 Broadway shows. He had grossed $18 million in theater revenue before he was 40. He was already one of the great showmen of the 20th century when he decided, with characteristic theatricality, that he was going to marry Elizabeth Taylor. He told her directly, "You are going to marry only one guy, see? And his name is me." She laughed. Then she said yes. They married on the 2nd of February, 1957, in Acapulco, Mexico. Elizabeth was 3 months pregnant. On the 6th of August, 1957, Elizabeth Frances Todd, called Liza, was born by cesarean section in New York City, weighing 4 pounds and 14 ounces. The birth brought the Taylor-Todd marriage to its highest visible point. Mike Todd celebrated with the extravagance that defined him. In June of 1957, he threw himself a birthday party at Madison Square Garden, attended by 18,000 guests, broadcast live on CBS, a home in the Hamptons. A private plane, named, with a tenderness that would later become unbearable, the Liz. A yacht, diamonds from Bulgari, a life that the press called the most spectacular marriage in the world. She had everything, everything. 3 children under 5, a man who matched her energy and matched it back doubled. A household staff of 12 at their primary residence in Connecticut. A career that had just shifted into its most critically celebrated period. A party list that included Mike's close friend Eddie Fisher and his wife, the actress Debbie Reynolds, who were among the couple's most frequent guests. But there is one detail worth holding. In June of 1957, at the peak of the Mike Todd marriage, Elizabeth said to a reporter, "I don't ever want him to leave me. Promise me you'll never leave me." She was speaking to Mike. She would say almost identical words to Richard Burton, 11 years later, on a boat off the coast of Ischia. She had not yet learned that the words do not work as a binding agent. Within 7 months of the birth of Liza Todd, everything would change. I told you the plane was named the Liz. I will return to that. Before we go any further, you need to understand one thing about Elizabeth Taylor and her children. She was not a conventional mother. The record on this is not disputed by any serious biographer. William J. Mann, who wrote the authoritative account of her Hollywood years, said plainly, "She wasn't a hands-on mother, necessarily. There were a lot of nannies and assistants to take care of the kids." Mann's description of her parenting style is precise. She was more of the pal than the disciplinarian. She was the kind of mother who said, "I'm here if you want to talk to me." What this looked like in practice. Michael Jr. and Christopher Wilding spent much of their early childhood in Europe, educated across multiple countries, uprooted with each new film location, managed by a rotating system of caregivers, while their mother occupied a parallel universe of lights and costumes and studios. When Elizabeth and Mike Todd were living at full intensity in 1957, their household included the two Wilding boys, the infant Liza, Mike's adult son Michael Todd Jr. from his first marriage, and a domestic staff whose job was to maintain order in a home that had no regular hours, no fixed geography, and no quiet. And yet, every account of Elizabeth as a mother, even the most critical, arrives at the same contradiction. She was not physically present in the way that conventional motherhood requires. But when her children needed her, she was ferociously, unstoppably there. When Michael Jr. had a serious health episode in adolescence, she cancelled filming. When Christopher brought home the woman he intended to marry, a young woman whose family background would shortly detonate a crisis that touched the entire AIDS epidemic, Elizabeth threw them a party attended by Sissy Spacek, Carol Burnett, and Dudley Moore. When Maria, the adopted daughter, fled a collapsing marriage in 2000, with a 2-year-old son in her arms, Elizabeth opened her Bel Air home without conditions and told the press nothing. There is a line from Mann about this pattern that stays. He called her the mother hen when those kids were threatened. It is the right phrase. Elizabeth Taylor was not a hen in the ordinary sense. She was something closer to a hawk that chose, most of the time, to sit still, but whose response when her children were endangered was total and without mercy. The children themselves kept quiet about what it was actually like inside. They gave few interviews. They offered careful, loving public statements. Michael Jr. told a reporter in 2011 that she was the proudest of anything to him. Christopher said she was a big extended family. Liza declined to discuss her childhood on the record almost entirely. What they did not discuss, what no biography has ever fully examined, is what it was like to watch the marriages arrive and depart like weather systems, and to understand, from very young ages, that the eye of the storm was always their mother. On the evening of the 21st of March, 1958, Mike Todd kissed Elizabeth goodbye in their New York apartment. She had a fever of 104 degrees. Her doctor had advised against flying. Mike was headed to Albuquerque, New Mexico, to deliver a speech for the Friars Club. He was to be named Showman of the Year the following night at a ceremony attended by 1,200 people at the Waldorf Astoria in Manhattan. Before he left, he asked the doctor, "Am I wrong?" The doctor said, "I'd say there's going to be one less than 1,200 at the Waldorf tomorrow night." The plane, named the Liz, took off from Burbank Airport at 10 minutes past 11 o'clock on the night of the 21st of March. It was carrying Mike Todd, a writer named Art Cohn, who was working on Todd's biography, and 2 crew members. The weather was poor. In the early hours of the 22nd of March, the Liz went down near Grants, New Mexico, in the Zuni Mountains. There were no survivors. It was approximately 3 o'clock in the morning when Elizabeth's phone rang, and she was told, "What happened inside that apartment is documented in the film footage of her face in the days that followed. What is less documented is what was happening simultaneously in the rooms of the children." Michael Jr. was 5 years old. Christopher was 3. Liza was 7 months old, too young to understand that the man Elizabeth called Fathead and my love, and the only man in my life who gave me back my self-respect, had been erased from the world in the night. You need to sit with that image for a moment. A woman lying in a New York apartment with a fever and a 7-month-old daughter, hearing that the plane named after her has crashed and that the man who named it is gone. And in the adjacent rooms, 2 small boys asleep and an infant who will grow up never once remembering his face. Here is the suppressed detail that the official record does not surface clearly. Elizabeth was so devastated that she had to return to work within 3 weeks. Not because she chose to, because Mike Todd had died with large debts, and the studio made it plain that the picture, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, could not be held further. She later said that acting was the only time I could function in those weeks. She was playing Maggie the cat, a woman desperate to hold on to a man who does not want her. She said, "In a way, I became Maggie. Now plant this." Liza Todd would later become a sculptor of horses and animals. She would build a life of extraordinary quiet on a 55-acre farm in upstate New York that she calls, with a dry humor her mother would have recognized, Fecal Manor. The name of the plane her father died in was the Liz. I will return to that. Here is the part that no biography has ever fully explained. Within months of Mike Todd's death, while Elizabeth was still filming Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, in a condition her director described as barely functioning, she began a relationship with Eddie Fisher. Fisher was Mike Todd's closest friend. He was also married to Debbie Reynolds, who was one of Elizabeth's own close friends, a woman the American press had mythologized as the nation's sweetheart. The scandal that followed was not, at its core, about adultery. Adultery was something Hollywood processed regularly. The scandal was about the specific geometry of betrayal. Widow, dead husband's best friend, that friend's wife. America decided Elizabeth Taylor was a homewrecker, and the studio that had shaped her image since childhood watched its investment sour on the front pages of every newspaper in the country. What the household staff saw during this period, what the nannies and assistants and tutors who circled the children's lives understood, was something different from what the press was publishing. Inside the house, there were 3 young children who had lost a father and were now watching their mother remake her world at speed. Michael Jr., 6 years old. Christopher, barely 4. Liza, less than a year. Elizabeth and Fisher married at the Temple Beth Shalom in Las Vegas on the 12th of May, 1959. The press called her the most hated woman in America. Hedda Hopper, who had been Elizabeth's informal godmother and professional sponsor since childhood, published a column after an off-the-record conversation that Elizabeth thought was private. Elizabeth called Hopper from a hotel room and screamed into the phone, "You betrayed me!" Hopper's response, delivered with the measured cruelty of a woman who had seen everything. I would imagine Debbie is singing the same song these days. What this meant for the children is not something Elizabeth ever fully addressed in any interview. What is documented, in the account of biographer Alexander Walker and in the recollections of people who were present, is that the rotating door of marriages and scandals generated a kind of background turbulence that the children could not name, but could not escape. As Michael Wilding Jr. would say to his friend William Mann years later, "My mother protected us from the circus." The careful choice of the word circus, rather than scandal, or chaos, is itself a kind of testimony. It implies performance. It implies that the chaos was, at some level, managed, that there was a person behind the tent flap who was also, simultaneously, trying to be a mother. And here, for the first time, the shape of what the children would become starts to come visible. Not one of them would replicate their mother's public life. Not one of them would court the kind of attention she generated. As if they had each, separately, looked at the circus she described and decided, not that, something else, something quieter, something made of stone. This was not the first time Elizabeth Taylor's children would watch a father figure disappear. But the second disappearance was different in one crucial way. Mike Todd died without warning, in the night, in metal and flame in the mountains of New Mexico. The departure of Richard Burton was something the children watched in installments, over years, across 2 marriages and 2 divorces, through a theatre of public warfare that made the Todd death look almost simple in its clean completeness. Richard Burton entered the family's life during the filming of Cleopatra in Rome in 1962. He had been hired to play Mark Antony opposite Elizabeth's Cleopatra. He arrived on set hungover, shaking with what he called stage fright, and what was, in the assessment of every person who knew him well, the first visible stages of a dependency that would later consume him. He was brilliant, ferociously intelligent, lyrical in a way that Elizabeth had never encountered in a man, and he was married to a woman named Sybil who understood him completely and whom he was about to destroy. The children were watching. In Rome in 1962, Michael Jr. was 9 years old, Christopher was 7, and Liza was 4. The paparazzi photographs of that period show the children at the edges of the Taylor-Burton spectacle, glimpsed through car windows, caught briefly on the terrace of the rented Villa Papa in Rome, described in one Italian newspaper as the small entourage that the great storm carries with it. Richard Burton legally adopted both Liza Todd and Maria Burton, the German orphan Elizabeth had begun adopting with Eddie Fisher, when he and Elizabeth married on the 15th of March 1964 in a private ceremony at the Ritz-Carlton, Montreal. He became, for a period, the most present father figure the 4 children had known. Biographer Sam Kashner, drawing on documented family accounts, describes a household in which Burton and Taylor, however ferociously they fought in public, came home from the set and played word games with the children. Holidays on the yacht Charisma, named for the daughters Kate, Liza, and Maria, were occasions that later emerged in the recollections of grandchildren as almost mythically warm. But Burton's drinking was advancing. The second marriage dissolved in July of 1976, 1 year after the remarriage in Kasane, Botswana, and Burton died on the 5th of August, 1984, of a cerebral hemorrhage in Séligné, Switzerland, alone, separated from Elizabeth, his liver destroyed. She had spent her entire life with a father she never remembered, and a stepfather she had watched disintegrate. She chose horses, she chose bronze and stone, she chose a farm with no cameras, and a name that was an inside joke about manure. When a reporter from the Daily Mail asked her as a teenager whether she wanted to be an actress, she said, "An actress? Ugh." She had made her decision young. On the 5th of February 1963, the Vatican newspaper L'Osservatore Romano published a formal condemnation of Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton by name. They were accused of erotic vagrancy, the term meaning a kind of moral homelessness, an incapacity for appropriate attachment, spread through the international press within hours. There were calls in the United States Congress to bar both of them from re-entering the country. The scandal was, by the measure of its scale and the institutions it mobilized, unlike any private marital affair that had previously generated public consequence. The children were living inside this. Liza Todd was 5 years old in 1963. Michael Jr. was 10. Christopher was 8. Maria, the recently adopted German orphan born in Munich on the 8th of January 1961, was 2. What the Vatican was debating, what the American Congress was discussing, What every newspaper on 3 continents was printing was who was sleeping with their mother. The documented reaction inside the family is contained in one specific detail. Michael Jr. recalled to a journalist years later that paparazzi had become so aggressive during the Rome filming period that the children had been given permission to turn the garden hose on telephoto camera lenses that appeared over the walls of their rented home. He described it as though it were slightly amusing, but the image itself, a 10-year-old boy defending the perimeter of his family home with a garden hose against adults hired by international newspapers to photograph his mother's scandal, communicates something that amusement cannot quite reach. What the press was mocking was not actually the secret. The Vatican and the columnists were scandalized by the love affair, by the public declarations, by the Bulgari jewels and the paparazzi shots on the Ischia yacht. But the real secret, the one that no contemporary account paused to examine, was simpler and less spectacular. 4 children were being carried through this. 4 small people were in the middle of what every adult in their world was treating as either a catastrophe or a spectacle, and they had no vocabulary for it yet, and no safe distance from it. Maria was too young to process any of it, but her situation was the most acute. She had been found in a German orphanage, born with a congenital hip deformity severe enough to require surgery, already beginning the first of what would eventually become nearly 24 operations. The reason Elizabeth gave for wanting to adopt her, when the defect was discovered, was a sentence that was reported at the time and has not been sufficiently dwelt upon since. "I want her all the more, because she's ill. Maybe I can do something to help." That sentence is not the statement of a woman performing public virtue. It is the statement of a woman who understood, on some deep cellular level, what it felt like to be a child, whose body was used by others for purposes that had nothing to do with her own desires. She recognized something. She moved toward it. The years from 1964 through the early 1970s were the years in which the Taylor-Burton empire was at its largest and its most exhausting. They had a combined annual income that Burton himself compared to the gross domestic product of a small African nation. Their primary residence was a yacht, the Charisma, which served as a floating home across the Mediterranean and the Caribbean. Their secondary residences included a chalet in Gstaad, Switzerland, a house in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, a property in London, and whatever rented villa the current film required. The children navigated this geography by developing a relationship with boarding schools. Liza Todd attended a private school in Gstaad, Switzerland. The Wilding boys were educated across Europe. Maria, still undergoing surgeries for her hip condition, required more fixed care. She spent extended periods in medical facilities, and in the company of specialists Elizabeth had personally identified and retained. What this created, in practical terms, was a childhood that existed in the intervals between the great events, when the filming was done, when the marriages were between eruptions, when Burton was sober enough to play word games at the dinner table and Elizabeth was between hospitalization and performance. In those intervals, according to the people who witnessed them, the family was genuinely warm, genuinely present. Liza Todd spent time on the set of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf in 1966, the film widely considered the finest work of Elizabeth Taylor's career. She was 8 years old. She watched her mother play Martha, a woman destroying a marriage with language, with cruelty, with a kind of weaponized intelligence that the script required to be performed at full volume for weeks. The director, Mike Nichols, told associates that he wanted the film to feel like watching 2 people dismantle each other in real time. Liza was sitting in the chairs on the edge of the set, watching. When journalists later asked Liza about acting, she was consistently dismissive. The word "erg" was hers, but the deeper reason was probably less about rejection than about education. She had seen acting, had seen what it required, what it cost, what it did to the people who surrendered to it completely. She had seen her mother become Maggie the cat in order to survive Mike Todd's death. She had seen Martha. She had formed, at a young age, a clear opinion about what she wanted to do with the thing inside her that her mother put into performance and scandal. She wanted to put it into bronze. This is the first of 3 original teasers being paid off. I told you Liza's farm was called Fecal Manor, named with a dry humour her mother would have recognised. Here is what it means. It is the name of a woman who took everything the world expected her to be. Daughter of legends, inheritor of spectacle, and made of it something useful, something grounded, something that feeds horses and sculpts their bodies in bronze, and gives all its profits to orphaned elephants in South Africa. On Sunset Strip in Los Angeles in 1981, Christopher Wilding, the second son of Elizabeth Taylor, then 26 years old, eloped with a young woman named Aileen Getty. Aileen was 20 years old. She was the granddaughter of J. Paul Getty, identified in the 1960s by Fortune magazine as the richest private individual in the world. Her family was one of the wealthiest in the world and one of the most dysfunctional. Her brother, Paul Getty III, had been kidnapped in Rome in 1973 when she was 12 years old, held for 5 months, and had one of his ears cut off by the kidnappers before the ransom was paid. The family's response to the kidnapping, her grandfather initially refused to pay, suspecting a hoax, had permanently fractured Aileen's sense of safety and trust. By the time she encountered Christopher, she was, by the account of several people who knew her then, a young woman who had survived extraordinary trauma and was looking for stability in all the wrong places. Before the elopement, Aileen had spent time in the orbit of the Wilding brothers. Elizabeth Taylor, with the instinct of someone who had learned to read rooms, threw the couple a star-studded party at Gail Harris Getty's Los Angeles home that included Sissy Spacek, Carol Burnett, and Dudley Moore. Elizabeth liked Aileen. She saw in her something she recognized, a young woman shaped by forces too large for any individual to control, trying to build a life in the aftermath. Christopher and Aileen had 2 sons together, Caleb, born in 1983, and Andrew, born in 1984. By 1984, Aileen had been diagnosed as HIV positive. She later said publicly that she was unsure whether the source was a blood transfusion or an extramarital affair. What is documented is that by the mid-1980s, she was struggling with addiction and depression severe enough to require repeated hospitalization. Christopher and Elizabeth were the only people who knew about her illness for a significant period. According to accounts published after the fact, Aileen, in the grip of self-destruction, told her mother-in-law her secret during a trip to Paris that Elizabeth had invited her on. Elizabeth was traveling in her role as president of AMFAR, the Foundation for AIDS Research she had co-founded after Rock Hudson's death. Christopher divorced Aileen in 1987. He was granted custody of the children. Aileen later said that Christopher, growing tired of being her nursemaid, was part of the collapse, and those accounts are consistent with the documented timeline. What Aileen gave Christopher, what she cost him, is not a simple ledger. She gave him sons. She gave him a connection to the AIDS crisis that was, through his mother's activism, already reshaping what the Taylor family name would mean to history. She cost him the marriage, the years of watching someone he had loved lose the fight against herself. He never discussed it publicly in any detail. He kept the photographs. He became a sound editor. Now is the time to turn the camera fully on what each of these 4 children actually paid for the life they were born into. Michael Howard Wilding Jr., born January 6, 1953. He was the eldest, the one who watched the most. He spent his 20s in countercultural spaces, living on a commune in the 1970s, fathering his first daughter, Laila, with his first wife Beth Clutter in 1970, and his second daughter, Naomi, in 1975, with a partner named Johanna Lukadan, while still, documentably, living communally with Beth and Laila on the same property. The image is striking, the son of the world's most photographed woman, choosing to raise children on a commune, to deliberately unmake every structure of visibility and privilege that the name Taylor represented. He eventually found his way to sculpture in Santa Fe, New Mexico. He married Brooke Palance, daughter of the Oscar-winning actor Jack Palance, in 1982, and with her had a son, Tarquin, in 1989. His daughter Naomi said in 2021 that her grandmother believed she was responsible for raising the younger generations of the family. Michael's children now work for the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation. On the day his mother died, he issued one public statement. "We know, quite simply, that the world is a better place for Mum having lived in it. It is the sentence of a man who made peace with something enormous." Christopher Edward Wilding, born February 27, 1955. He paid through Aileen. He paid through the AIDS crisis arriving inside his own marriage, through watching his ex-wife become an activist and a survivor, while he became a photographer and a sound editor, quiet and retired in Calabasas, California, displaying no public ambition, no public grief. He told one interviewer, "She was so beautiful, some people tended to overlook her great acting chops." His mother's Oscar for Butterfield 8 sits on his bookshelf. The first one, the one she hated, Elizabeth Frances Todd, called Liza, born August 6, 1957. She paid in fatherlessness, in the knowledge that the plane her mother named after herself was the one that killed Mike Todd. She paid with boarding school in Gistad, while her mother and Burton burned the world. She paid and earned her own quiet back. She lives on 55 acres in upstate New York. Bronze horses, orphaned elephants, fecal manor. Maria Burton Carson, born January 8, 1961, Munich, Germany. She paid in her body first. Nearly 24 surgeries for a congenital hip deformity that she endured with her mother beside her through every procedure. She paid again in a marriage to talent agent Steve Carson that ended when she fled to Elizabeth's Bel Air home in 2000 with a 2-year-old son, and her estranged husband publicly blamed Elizabeth for using star power to break up his family. She paid in a second marriage that ended in divorce amid allegations of abuse. She lives in Idaho now. She gives no interviews. 4 people, 4 different shapes of cost. One mother. By the late 1970s, Elizabeth Taylor was unrecognizable by the measurements that had once defined her. She had gained between 70 and 90 pounds during her marriage to the Republican Senator John Warner of Virginia, whom she had married on the 4th of December, 1976. A man who had noticed her at a bicentennial ball in Washington and who was, in Elizabeth's own words, safe. Warner ran for Senate. Elizabeth campaigned for him across Virginia, introducing herself from flatbed trucks as his country wife, wearing outfits the Southern Republican donor class found bewildering, interrupting his policy speeches by shouting "boo" when she disagreed. She was bored and lonely, and eating. There was no film set. There was no Richard Burton. There was a man who was in love with politics in the way that previous men in her life had been in love with her. Warner won his Senate seat in 1978. Elizabeth gained weight and became addicted to prescription painkillers and alcohol in a combination that her doctors documented but could not, for years, adequately treat. The specific trigger of the final visible collapse was a hospitalization in 1983. By her own account, she woke in a hospital bed, surrounded by her children, who told her clearly that she had a problem. "Am I hurting you?" she asked. The answer was yes. She checked herself into the Betty Ford Center in Rancho Mirage, California, in December of 1983, becoming the first celebrity to openly admit herself to the clinic by name. The courage of that admission, at a time when addiction was still treated as a character flaw rather than a medical condition, was genuine and historically significant. She later said, "I'm Elizabeth Taylor, and I'm an alcoholic." But what this section of her story requires you to hold is the image of the children in that hospital room. Michael Jr. would have been 30 years old. Christopher, 28. Liza, 26. Maria, 22. 4 people who had been raised inside a home that processed grief and loss and reinvention through performance and acquisition, and who now had to sit beside their mother's hospital bed and tell her the truth. There is a documented account from biographer Sam Kashner of a period in the late 1970s when Elizabeth was so medicated, so altered, that she barely tracked the conversations in her own home. There are the accounts of household staff during the Warner years of a woman who had been a radiant, terrifying force of nature, now sitting in a Virginia farmhouse, watching the animals she loved and struggling to get through the day. She would later say that what got her back, at the Betty Ford Center in the winter of 1983, in those first weeks of group sessions, sitting in a circle with people who did not know who she was and told her so directly, was an encounter with a man named Larry, a construction worker, a man who moved earth for a living. But before Larry, there was the second trip to rehab. There was Rock Hudson, and there was the work that would define her legacy more permanently than any film she ever made. In the last years of her life, Elizabeth Taylor lived at 700 Nimes Road in the Bel Air district of Los Angeles, a house she had occupied since 1982 and which she never left. She was diagnosed with congestive heart failure in 2004. She spent the final years of her life in a wheelchair, her back, broken in national velvet in 1944 and never properly treated, finally making the claims that 70 years of performance had deferred. Her children were present across those years, in the specific ways their separate lives allowed. Michael Jr. in Santa Fe, Christopher in Calabasas, Liza, upstate New York, Maria, Idaho. They came for holidays. They came for crises. They gathered, all 4 of them, at Buckingham Palace in the year 2000 to watch their mother be made a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire by Queen Elizabeth II. It was one of the last times all 4 were photographed together before her death. On the 8th of February 2011, Elizabeth was hospitalized at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. 6 weeks earlier, she had written a letter to her last ex-husband, Larry Fortensky, who had been severely injured in a fall in 1999 and had remained in her thoughts ever since. The letter read, "You're a part of my life that cannot be carved out, nor do I ever wish it to be." It was the last correspondence she sent before the hospitalization that ended with her death. On the 23rd of March, 2011, at the age of 79, Elizabeth Taylor died of congestive heart failure. Her children were with her. The funeral was held the following day at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Glendale, California. It was a private Jewish ceremony, presided over by Rabbi Jerome Cutler. At Elizabeth's explicit instruction, the service began 15 minutes late. She even wanted to be late for her own funeral. In the room at Cedars-Sinai, in the last days, there were objects arranged with the care of a person who had always understood the power of things to carry meaning. The Taylor Burton diamond was in a vault. The La Peregrina pearl, the 50-carat pearl that Richard Burton had given her for Valentine's Day in 1969, purchased at auction at Sotheby's in London for approximately $37,000, was in a case nearby. Both would later be auctioned at Christie's after her death, the entire jewelry collection selling for a record $156.8 million. But the object that mattered most in those final weeks was not a jewel. It was the Oscar, the first one, the one she won for Butterfield 8 in 1961, the film she despised, the role she called a whore, the performance forced on her by a studio that owned her body and her time. She had never destroyed it. She had kept it. Christopher asked for it. In the months after Elizabeth Taylor's death on the 23rd of March, 2011, Christie's auction house in New York and London prepared the most significant celebrity estate sale in the history of the art market. The jewelry alone sold for $156.8 million. The clothes and accessories brought an additional $5.5 million. The Taylor Burton diamond, 69.42 carats, given to Elizabeth by Richard Burton in 1969 after he outbid Cartier at a New York auction, sold to a private buyer for an undisclosed sum. The La Peregrina pearl, one of the most famous pearls in European history, sold for $11.8 million, setting a record for a pearl at auction. The Krupp diamond, 33.19 carats, another Burton gift, sold for $8.8 million. The proceeds went to the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation. The 4 children received their portions of an estate that legal experts at the time estimated at between $600 million and $1 billion. The specific numbers were never made public. The trust Elizabeth had established was private. What is known is that each child was provided for, and that the philanthropic work was endowed sufficiently to continue indefinitely. What happened to each child in the years that followed is the payoff of the second original teaser, the one about what the plane named the Liz eventually meant. Liza Todd, the child born to Mike Todd who died in the plane called the Liz, took her inheritance and used it in part to fund her sculpture work and her animal conservation efforts in South Africa. Her son, Quinn Tivy, became one of the trustees of the House of Taylor and the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation. Her son Reese became a jazz musician. They live near her on the 55 acres in upstate New York. The plane that killed Mike Todd is a footnote in aviation history. The woman it left behind built her life in bronze and stone and manure, as far from speed and spectacle as it is possible to travel. Michael Jr. in Santa Fe, Christopher in Calabasas, the first Oscar on his bookshelf, retirement following a career in sound editing that required no front-facing fame, Maria in Idaho, her daughter Eliza, now an ambassador for her grandmother's AIDS Foundation, 10 grandchildren, several great-grandchildren, every one of them, in one form or another, connected to the foundation, and there is a detail discovered only in the accounts published after the Christie's auction. One of the documents prepared for the estate included a letter, written in Elizabeth's hand, that was sealed and given to each child privately. The contents have never been revealed. Not by Michael, not by Christopher, not by Liza, not by Maria. The payoff of the third and final original teaser is this. The plane was named the Liz. It crashed. Liza survived. The name was not a curse. It was just a name. The children understood this sooner than the biographers did. In 2022, the House of Taylor released a 10-part podcast series called Elizabeth I, narrated by Katy Perry. In 2022, the authorized biography by Kate Anderson Brower was published, the first biography produced with the cooperation of the estate. In 2024, an HBO documentary series called Elizabeth Taylor, The Lost Tapes, used recordings from Elizabeth's own voice, drawn from never-released audio interviews, to present her speaking in the present tense about her own life. What emerged from those materials, what the record, when you examine it without the tabloid framing, actually contains, is a significant recalibration of who Elizabeth Taylor actually was as a mother. What the press called neglectful, the record calls structurally impossible. She was 18 when she had her first child, contractually obligated to a studio that scheduled her life by the quarter hour. She had no model for a different kind of motherhood. Her own mother, Sarah Southern, had used Elizabeth's face as the instrument of her own ambitions from the time the child was 7 years old. What Sarah called love was also management. What Elizabeth passed on to her children was something more complicated, the fierce warmth of a woman who was never properly mothered herself, doing what she could in the margins of a life that belonged, in most of its hours, to other people. The clinical reappraisal, what Taylor was not, matters here. She was not absent in the sense that word usually implies. She was more of a pal, William Mann said, and he meant it descriptively, not critically. The children did not describe a cold mother. They described a specific kind of warmth, the warmth of a person who made herself utterly available when available, and trusted her children to fill in the gaps. As Michael Jr.'s daughter Naomi told Today in 2021, she had an idea that she was responsible for raising the younger generations in the family. It was important to her that she instilled those values in us too. What the press called the home wrecker and the erotic vagrant and the woman who destroyed 3 marriages was, in the testimony of her own grandchildren, the person responsible for teaching them what generosity looked like. What the Vatican condemned, her grandchildren absorbed as the foundation of humanitarian work that now spans 3 generations. The most heartbreaking detail that only emerged late, contained in a passage in the Brower biography and referenced in the HBO documentary, is this. Elizabeth Taylor believed, with a sincerity that cannot be explained by performance, that her children were her proudest accomplishment. Not the Oscars, not the diamonds, not the marriages or the performances or the money. They make me the proudest of anything that I've ever done, she said. She said it in the present tense, repeatedly, until the last years of her life. What history called a life of excess was, from the inside, a life structured around love. The love was imperfect. It was loud and late, and frequently surrounded by nannies. But it was real. Come back to the room, the 6th floor of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. The 23rd of March, 2011. The 4 of them gathered around the bed of the woman they had called, all their lives, Mum, the British pronunciation she kept from the childhood she spent in Hampstead, the same way she kept her violet eyes and her double lashes, and the accent she never fully surrendered to California. In that room, everything this story has built is now visible at once. Michael Jr., 58 years old, the sculptor from Santa Fe, who had grown up on a commune while his mother was the most famous woman in the world. Christopher, 56, the photographer and sound editor from Calabasas, who had married a Getty on Sunset Strip and watched the AIDS crisis arrive inside his own front door while his mother was building the infrastructure to fight it. Liza, 53, the horse sculptor from upstate New York, daughter of the man who died in the plane called the Liz, who had stood at the edge of a movie set at age 8 and watched her mother play Martha in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, and decided, with the clarity of a child who has already seen enough, that she would make things out of bronze instead. And Maria, 50, the woman from Munich who had been found in an orphanage, unable to walk properly, who had endured nearly 24 surgeries, who had fled a disintegrating marriage and arrived at this same woman's door with a 2-year-old son in her arms and been taken in without conditions. The central symbolic device planted in the first section of this story completes its circle here. The Oscar for Butterfield 8, the film Elizabeth Taylor despised, the role she called playing a whore, the performance MGM forced out of her as the price of her final contractual obligation, is now on a bookshelf in Calabasas. Christopher Wilding asked for it specifically. He said, "I'm thrilled to have the Oscar. She was so beautiful. Some people tended to overlook her great acting chops. He chose the Oscar she hated, not the one she loved. He kept the evidence of what it cost her." The answer to the question asked at the beginning of this video, how does someone married 8 times to 7 men, condemned by the Vatican, chased across 3 continents, consumed by grief and addiction and reinvention, how does that person raise 4 children who turned out whole? Is this: she loved them with the only love she knew. Imperfect, theatrical, surrounded by nannies and fireworks and paparazzi, frequently spectacular in its failures, but continuous, uninterrupted from the day each one of them arrived until the day she could not continue. Every marriage failed, the love for the children did not. Michael Jr. said it precisely: the world is a better place for Mum having lived in it. The children turned out whole because they knew she believed that. The Oscar is on the shelf,